A thief broke into a house thinking it would be easy, but was surprised by a wild bobcat that jumped in front of him to protect an elderly woman. The animal's reaction shocked even the police, and what happened next was simply unbelievable. Subscribe to the channel and find out why this story stopped the whole city. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the wooden porch of Ellena Thompson's modest cabin. At 73, Ellena still maintained her daily routines with the same determination that had carried her through decades of teaching at Pinewood Elementary. Her silver hair was pulled back into a neat bun as she rocked gently in her favorite chair, overlooking the sprawling wilderness that surrounded her property on the outskirts of Whispering Pines, Montana. The cabin had been her sanctuary for the past 15 years, ever since she retired and decided city life in Minneapolis no longer suited her. Here, nestled between towering pines and rugged mountains, Eleanor had found a peace she never knew she needed. The nearest neighbor, Roy Jenkins, lived half a mile down the winding dirt road, and the small town center was a 20-minute drive away. It was exactly the kind of solitude Eleanor cherished. "Time for our evening walk, isn't it?" she murmured, seemingly to herself. But her words weren't directed at empty air. From the edge of the forest, a pair of amber eyes watched attentively. The bobcat, a magnificent specimen with tufted ears and spotted fur, had been a presence in Eleanor's life almost since she'd moved to the cabin. What had begun as occasional sightings from a distance had evolved into something remarkable and unexpected. Eleanor had named him Rusty for the reddish tinge in his coat. Though she knew wildlife experts would disapprove, she couldn't help feeling there was something special about their connection. Rusty wasn't a pet. He remained wild and independent. But over the years, a mutual understanding had developed between them. "Come on then," she said, rising from her rocking chair with practiced care, her joints protesting slightly. "Let's check on the garden before it gets dark." As if understanding, Rusty emerged from the tree line, padding silently across the clearing that separated the forest from Eleanor's carefully tended garden. He kept a respectful distance, moving parallel to her path, but never approaching too closely. His behavior was unusual for a bobcat, a fact that puzzled the few people who had witnessed it. "Ms. Thompson, you really shouldn't encourage that wild animal to hang around," Sheriff Mike Donovan had warned during one of his occasional wellness checks on the community's older residents. "Bobcats aren't house cats, they're predators." Eleanor had merely smiled. "Rusty knows his place, and I know mine, Sheriff. We've had an understanding for years now." The sheriff had shaken his head in disbelief, but ultimately left her be. Ellena Thompson was known throughout Whispering Pines for her gentle stubbornness and sound judgment. If anyone could maintain an unusual friendship with a wild bobcat without incident, it would be the former schoolteacher who had once calmed an entire classroom during a severe blizzard that had left them stranded for 2 days. As Eleanor inspected her tomato plants, she noticed something unusual. The soil around one corner of the garden had been disturbed, and not in the way local wildlife typically foraged. It looked more like someone had stepped heavily through the bed, leaving an unmistakable boot print. "Now that's odd," she murmured, bending carefully to examine the print. It was definitely human, and far too large to be her own. Rusty approached, his posture suddenly alert. He sniffed at the disturbed earth and emitted a low growl, his tail twitching in agitation. "I know," Eleanor said softly. "Someone's been here who shouldn't have been." She glanced toward the tree line, scanning the forest edge with newfound wariness. For the first time in years, her beloved sanctuary felt slightly less secure. Eleanor had few valuables. Her life was intentionally simple, but the isolation that usually provided comfort suddenly seemed like a vulnerability. That evening, as shadows lengthened across her property, Eleanor locked her doors, something she rarely bothered with. From her kitchen window, she spotted Rusty patrolling the perimeter of her yard, his movements purposeful and vigilant. The bobcat's behavior struck her as unusual. Typically, he would retreat into the forest as darkness. "Fell to hunt. You feel it too, don't you?" she whispered, watching the animal pace back and forth along the edge of her property. The following morning, Eleanor woke earlier than usual. As she prepared her breakfast of oatmeal and black coffee, she noticed the faint outline of Rusty, still keeping watch from beneath the large spruce tree near her woodpile. The bobcat appeared not to have left all. Night. After breakfast, Eleanor decided to walk the property line, something she hadn't done in months. Behind her cabin, where the land sloped gently toward a small creek, she found more evidence that someone had been trespassing. A crude path had been worn through the underbrush, not by animals, but by human footsteps. Halfway down the path, Eleanor discovered a cigarette butt, a brand she didn't recognize. "Well now," she muttered, her brow furrowing. "This is concerning." Rusty appeared beside her, startling Eleanor slightly. The bobcat's ears were flattened against his head as he stared down the unfamiliar path. His entire body seemed tense, coiled with potential energy. Later that afternoon, Eleanor drove into town for her weekly shopping. At the general store, she casually mentioned the evidence of trespassers to Ben Wilson, the store's owner for the past 30 years. "Might be hikers cutting through," Ben suggested, but his expression betrayed concern. "Or could be those seasonal workers from the lumber camp. I heard they've been hiring some rougher types these days." "Perhaps," Eleanor replied, not entirely convinced. Her property wasn't on any hiking trail, and it would require deliberate effort to reach her isolated cabin. As she loaded her groceries into her aging Ford pickup, Eleanor noticed a truck she didn't recognize parked across the street. A man leaned against it, watching her with what seemed like casual interest. When their eyes met, he quickly looked away, lighting a cigarette. Even from this distance, Eleanor could tell it was the same brand she'd found on her property. The drive back to her cabin felt longer than usual, Eleanor's mind racing with possibilities. She'd lived peacefully in Whispering Pines for 15 years, knowing most residents by name. Strangers weren't common, especially not those who took an interest in an elderly woman living alone in the woods. When she arrived home, Eleanor was surprised to find Roy Jenkins's truck parked near her porch. Her neighbor was examining something on the ground by her front steps. "Roy," she called, shutting off her engine. "Everything all right?" The weathered rancher straightened up, adjusting his worn cowboy hat. "Afternoon, Eleanor. Thought I'd check in on you. Sally made too much apple pie yesterday, and I knew you'd help us out by taking some off our hands." He gestured toward a covered dish on her porch railing. It was a thin excuse. The Jenkins lived half a mile away and rarely made social calls without planning ahead. Eleanor appreciated the gesture for what it was, neighborly concern. "That's kind of you both," she said, gathering her grocery bags. "Would you like some coffee?" Inside, as Eleanor brewed coffee, Roy's expression grew serious. "Found some strange tracks around your place, Eleanor, and not animal tracks. Someone's been snooping around here." Eleanor nodded, recounting her discoveries and the man she'd seen in town. "I'm not one to jump to conclusions, but it's unsettling." Roy frowned, his weathered face creasing with concern. "There's been talk in town about some break-ins at cabins further up the mountain. Nothing major. Food, tools, that sort of thing. But still, not something we're used to around here." "I don't have much worth taking," Eleanor said. "Maybe not," Roy agreed, "but you're out here alone. That might make you an easy target for someone looking for opportunity." He hesitated. "Sally and I were thinking maybe you'd like to stay with us for a while, just until Sheriff Donovan figures out who's behind these break-ins." Eleanor smiled but shook her head. "I appreciate the offer, Roy, but this is my home. I'm not about to be chased away by some petty thief." As Roy left, promising to check in again soon, Eleanor noticed Rusty watching from the tree line. The key. Bobcat's eyes followed Roy's truck until it disappeared down the winding road. "Well, Rusty," Ellena said, addressing her unusual companion, "it seems we might need to be extra vigilant for a while." That night, Ellena slept fitfully, waking at every unfamiliar sound. Shortly after midnight, she was startled fully awake by a distinct noise on her front porch, the unmistakable creak of a floorboard beneath a heavy foot. Heart pounding, she reached for the phone on her bedside table, ready to call for help. Before she could dial, another sound caught her attention, a low, threatening growl from outside, followed by a startled shout and hurried footsteps retreating into the night. By the time Ellena gathered her courage and carefully approached the window, all she could see was Rusty, sitting calmly on her porch steps as if nothing had happened, his amber eyes gleaming in the moonlight. The following morning, Ellena studied her front porch carefully. In the soft light of dawn, she discovered fresh scratches on the wooden railing and what appeared to be a torn piece of fabric. Caught on one of the nails, the evidence confirmed what she had heard in the night. Someone had indeed attempted to approach her cabin, only to be driven away by Rusty's unexpected intervention. "I suppose I owe you some thanks," she said to the Bobcat, who was perched on the woodpile nearby, grooming himself as if he hadn't performed an unusual act of protection hours earlier. Ellena tucked the scrap of fabric into her pocket and went about her morning routine, but with a heightened sense of awareness. As she watered her garden, she found herself glancing toward the tree line more frequently than usual. The forest that had always brought her comfort now held uncertain shadows and hidden threats. By mid-morning, Ellena had made a decision. She reached for the phone and dialed Sheriff Donovan's office. "Sheriff, it's Ellena Thompson," she said when he answered. "I believe someone tried to break into my cabin last night." 20 minutes later, the sheriff's patrol SUV pulled up. In front of her cabin, Mike Donovan emerged, adjusting his uniform hat as he surveyed the property with a professional eye. In his mid-40s, with salt and pepper hair and a trim mustache, the sheriff had served Whispering Pines for over a decade. He knew every resident by name and considered their safety his personal responsibility. "Morning, Ms. Thompson," he called, approaching the porch where Ellena waited. "You said there was a disturbance?" Ellena led him around the cabin, pointing out the evidence she'd found. When she handed him the scrap of fabric, his expression darkened. "This matches the description of a jacket worn by a man we've been keeping an eye on," he admitted. "Goes by the name of Derek Wade. Drifted into town about 3 weeks ago, claiming to be looking for seasonal work." "Is he dangerous?" Ellena asked directly. Sheriff Donovan considered his words carefully. "No record of violent crimes, but he's got a history of burglary in neighboring counties. Seems to target remote properties, particularly those occupied by older folks living alone." He looked at Ellena with undisguised concern. "I strongly recommend you stay with friends in town for a few days, Miss Thompson, at least until we locate Wade and have a serious conversation with him." Eleanor shook her head firmly. "This is my home, Sheriff. I won't be driven from it by fear." "Then at least let me install some additional security measures," he insisted. "Better locks, motion sensor lights, and promise you'll call at the first sign of anything suspicious." As they discussed security options, a low growl emanated from the nearby trees. Sheriff Donovan's hand instinctively moved toward his holster, but Ellena placed a calming hand on his arm. "It's just Rusty," she explained. "He's been particularly protective recently." The sheriff followed her gaze to where the Bobcat sat partially concealed among the underbrush, amber eyes fixed intently on the uniformed visitor. "That wild animal actually chased off an intruder?" Donovan asked incredulously. "I believe he did," Ellena confirmed. "I heard a commotion last night, growling, then a shout and someone running away." The sheriff shook his head in disbelief. "Ms. Thompson, I've been in law enforcement for 20 years, and I've never heard of a wild bobcat defending a human's property. It's not natural behavior." Ellena smiled slightly. Perhaps not for most bobcats, Sheriff, but Rusty and I have an understanding. After the sheriff left, promising to patrol the area more frequently and to return the next day with security equipment, Ellena sat on her porch and contemplated her situation. The rational part of her mind acknowledged the danger. A known burglar had targeted her home, and she was vulnerable due to her age and isolation, yet leaving felt like surrendering something precious. "What do you think, Rusty?" she asked the bobcat, who had returned to his favorite spot at the edge of the clearing. "Should I let fear chase me away from the home I've built?" The animal merely blinked slowly in response, but his continued presence felt like an answer in itself. Later that afternoon, Ellena was surprised by another visitor. A sleek silver SUV navigated the narrow dirt road to her cabin, and from it emerged a woman in her early 30s, dressed in practical hiking attire, but with a distinctly urban polish to her appearance. "Ms. Thompson?" the woman called, approaching with confident strides. "I'm Dr. Sarah Mitchell from the University of Montana's Wildlife Conservation Department. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" Ellena invited the young woman inside, curious about this unexpected visit. "Sheriff Donovan contacted our department," Dr. Mitchell explained as she accepted a cup of tea. "He mentioned an unusual situation with a local bobcat that seems to have formed a bond with you. As a wildlife behaviorist, I was immediately intrigued." Ellena wasn't entirely pleased that the sheriff had shared her business with a stranger, but she found herself warming to the earnest young researcher. "Rusty, that's what I call him, has been around for years. I never fed him or tried to tame him. He just chose to stay." Dr. Mitchell's eyes lit up with professional excitement. "That's extraordinarily rare behavior for a solitary predator like a bobcat. They typically avoid human contact unless habituated through feeding, which you say you haven't done." "No, never," Eleanor confirmed. "I respect that he's wild. Our relationship is based on mutual respect for boundaries." The conversation continued, with Dr. Mitchell asking detailed questions about Rusty's behavior patterns and the history of their unusual connection. When Ellena mentioned the previous night's incident, the researcher's expression shifted from academic interest to concern. "Ms. Thompson, what you're describing, a wild bobcat actively defending a human from another human, is unprecedented. In documented research, it suggests a level of bonding that challenges our understanding of these animals." Ellena smiled. "Sometimes I think we underestimate animals' capacity for connection, Dr. Mitchell. Rusty may be wild, but he's not simply an instinct-driven creature. He makes choices." As the discussion continued, Ellena gradually revealed more about her life. Before Whispering Pines, her 35 years teaching elementary school, the husband she'd lost to illness 2 decades earlier, and her decision to seek solitude in her retirement years. "It must get lonely out here," Dr. Mitchell observed. "I have my books, my garden, and occasional visits from neighbors," Ellena replied. "And Rusty, of course. It's a different kind of companionship, but meaningful nonetheless." As Dr. Mitchell prepared to leave, she paused at the doorway. "Would you allow me to set up some wildlife cameras around your property? With the recent security concerns, it might provide additional surveillance, and it would give us valuable research data about this extraordinary relationship." Ellena considered the request. "I suppose that would be acceptable, as long as they don't disturb Rusty or intrude on my privacy." "Of course," Dr. Mitchell assured her. "And Ms. Thompson, please be careful. I understand your attachment to your home and to Rusty, but your safety should come first." After the researcher departed, Ellena settled in her rocking chair on the porch, watching as the afternoon sunlight filtered through the pine trees. The day's conversations had left her with much to consider. Was she being foolishly stubborn by refusing to leave temporarily? Or was there something important about standing her ground, maintaining the life and home she had built for herself? As darkness began to fall, Rusty emerged from the forest edge and took up his now customary position near the porch steps. His vigilant presence was both comforting and concerning, a reminder of the threat that had disrupted Eleanor's peaceful existence. Inside the cabin, Ellena made her usual evening preparations with extra care, checking each window and door lock. Before retiring to bed, she placed the sheriff's business card and her phone on the bedside table within easy reach. Sleep came fitfully that night. Every creak of the cabin's wooden frame, every whisper of wind through the pine needles seemed amplified in the darkness. Shortly after midnight, Ellena was jolted awake by a sound she couldn't immediately identify, a sharp crack followed by a muffled thud. Heart racing, she reached for the phone, only to find that the line was dead. The realization sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the night air seeping through the windows. Someone had cut the phone line. Eleanor moved silently from her bed, grateful for the moonlight that illuminated her bedroom. From her dresser drawer, she retrieved a small flashlight and the pepper spray that Roy had insisted she keep on hand. Then, with deliberate calm that belied her racing heart, she approached the bedroom window that overlooked the front of the property. What she saw made her breath catch. A pickup truck was parked at the edge of her driveway, its lights off. A shadowy figure moved purposefully across her yard toward the cabin. It wasn't Derek Wade. This person was taller, broader, in the shoulders. Behind him, a second figure emerged from the truck. Eleanor's mind raced. 2 intruders, and her phone disabled. The nearest neighbor was half a mile away, too far to risk running in the dark, especially at her age. She would need to defend herself and her home until help could arrive. As she considered her options, a familiar form appeared at the edge of her vision. Rusty emerged from the shadows, his movements focused and deliberate as he tracked the approaching intruders. The Bobcat's behavior was nothing like his usual cautious demeanor. There was purpose in every silent step as he closed the distance between himself and the unwelcome visitors. The lead intruder had nearly reached the porch steps when Rusty made his presence known, not with an attack, but with a bone-chilling growl that cut through the night air. The man froze, then frantically swept the area with a flashlight until the beam caught the Bobcat's reflective eyes. "What the hell?" The man's startled voice carried clearly in the night air. "Scott, there's a damn wild cat here!" The second figure approached cautiously. "Just scare it off, Jake. It's probably more afraid of you than you are of it." But Rusty stood his ground, the growl building in intensity as he positioned himself between the intruders and Eleanor's cabin. The standoff continued for several tense moments, neither man willing to approach further with the angry predator blocking their path. Eleanor watched the tense standoff from her window, her heart pounding in her chest. The 2 men conferred in hushed tones, occasionally casting wary glances at Rusty, who remained unmoving, a living barrier between them and the cabin. "Just shoot the damn thing," the man called Jake finally said, reaching toward his waistband. In that moment, Ellena made a decision. She wouldn't cower inside while these men harmed the animal that had so faithfully protected her. With surprising steadiness, she flipped on her porch light and opened her front door. "I wouldn't do that. If I were you," she called out, her voice firm despite her fear. "Sheriff Donovan is on his way, and I have a shotgun pointed at your back." It was a bluff. Her late husband's shotgun hadn't been fired in 2 decades and remained unloaded in the closet. But the sudden light and her confident tone created enough doubt to give the intruders pause. The man named Scott took a step backward. "We don't want any trouble, lady. We were just looking for Derek. He said this place would be empty." "Well, as you can see, it isn't," Ellena replied, stepping fully onto the porch while keeping her right hand hidden behind the doorframe. and neither you nor Derek are welcome here." Jake seemed less intimidated. "You're bluffing, old woman. No sheriff's coming. We cut your phone line." Eleanor's smile was thin but triumphant. "Did you cut my cell phone too? Because Sheriff Donovan has a policy of responding to any call from seniors living alone within 15 minutes. I'd say you have about 10 minutes left before he arrives." The mention of the cell phone, which Eleanor indeed possessed, though she hadn't had a chance to use it, caused visible uncertainty between the men. Rusty chose that moment to advance a few steps, his growl intensifying. "This isn't worth it," Scott muttered to his partner. "Let's get out of here." Jake hesitated, clearly reluctant to abandon whatever plan they had formed. His hand still hovered near his waistband, and for a terrifying moment, Eleanor thought he might draw a weapon. Instead, Rusty lunged forward with a snarl that seemed to fill the entire clearing, stopping just short of the man's legs, but making his threat unmistakable. That was enough to break Jake's resolve. Both men retreated hastily to their truck, sending gravel flying as they accelerated down the driveway. The moment they disappeared from sight, Eleanor's legs nearly gave out beneath her. She sank onto the porch step, adrenaline still coursing through her body. Rusty approached slowly, his aggressive posture relaxing as the immediate threat receded. "Thank you," she whispered to the Bobcat, who sat at the foot of the steps, amber eyes still alert and focused on the driveway where the intruders had fled. "But we're not safe yet. They might come back with reinforcements." With shaking hands, Eleanor returned inside and retrieved her cell phone. She dialed Sheriff Donovan's number, grateful when he answered on the second ring, despite the late hour. "They're gone for now," she explained after recounting the incident. "But my landline's been cut, and I don't think they'll give up so easily." "I'm on my way," the sheriff assured her. "Stay inside, doors locked. I'll be there in 10 minutes. True to his word, Sheriff Donovan's patrol vehicle arrived in record time, lights flashing as it navigated the dirt road to her cabin. He wasn't alone. A second patrol car followed close behind. As the officers secured the area, Eleanor described the intruders and their connection to Derek Wade. Sheriff Donovan's expression grew increasingly grim. "Jake Collins and Scott Reeves," he confirmed. "They've been seen with Wade around town. Petty criminals graduating to more serious offenses, sounds like." He glanced around the darkened property. "Ms. Thompson, I can't leave you out here alone tonight. These men know where you live and might return." Before Eleanor could protest, Deputy Garcia, who had been examining the cut phone line, called out in surprise, "Sheriff, you need to see this." The young deputy was pointing to the edge of the clearing, where Rusty sat calmly watching the proceedings. "That's the Bobcat you mentioned?" "Sheriff," Donovan asked, observing the animal with newfound respect. "And it actually defended you?" "He," Eleanor corrected gently. "And yes, he placed himself between me and those men. They were going to shoot him, Sheriff." The revelation visibly angered Donovan. "Adding attempted animal cruelty to their charges," he muttered, making a note in his small flip pad. "Ms. Thompson, I understand your attachment to your home, but I must insist you come into town tonight. We can secure temporary accommodation at the Pinewood Inn." Eleanor looked to where Rusty maintained his vigilant watch. "What about him? I can't just leave him." "Ma'am, with all due respect, he's a wild animal. He survived before you moved here, and he'll manage while you're away temporarily." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a third vehicle, Dr. Mitchell's silver SUV. The wildlife researcher emerged, looking concerned. "I heard the radio call," she explained, approaching Eleanor. "Are you all right?" Sheriff Donovan looked annoyed at the civilian presence, but didn't object. When Eleanor briefly recounted the night's events to Dr. Mitchell, whose professional interest was clearly piqued by Rusty's protective behavior. "It's extraordinary," the researcher murmured, observing the Bobcat from a respectful distance. "This level of interspecies bonding and protective behavior challenges everything we understand about Bobcat psychology." "That's fascinating from a research perspective, Dr. Mitchell," Sheriff Donovan cut in. "But right now, my concern is Ms. Thompson's safety." "Actually," Dr. Mitchell said thoughtfully, "I might have a solution that addresses both concerns." She turned to Ellena. "I maintain a research cabin about 20 miles from here, within the university's wildlife conservation area. It's secure, comfortable, and would allow me to continue observing your interaction with Rusty in a controlled environment." The sheriff frowned. The Bobcat wouldn't follow her to a new location. Dr. Mitchell smiled. "That's exactly what I want to find out. If the bond is as strong as it appears, he might, and the research property is gated and monitored, which provides additional security." Ellena considered the offer. The thought of leaving her home felt like surrender, but the idea of contributing to scientific understanding of Rusty's unusual behavior appealed to her former teacher's heart. "Would I be able to return home once these men are apprehended?" she asked. "Of course," Dr. Mitchell assured her. "This would be temporary, a few days at most, I imagine, given how quickly Sheriff Donovan is likely to resolve this situation." The sheriff still seemed skeptical, but acknowledged the practical benefits of the arrangement. "It's certainly more secure than the Pinewood Inn, and if Dr. Mitchell is willing to take responsibility." By dawn, the decision had been finalized. Eleanor packed a small suitcase with essentials, while Deputy Garcia patrolled the property perimeter, and Sheriff Donovan coordinated with state police to locate the intruders. Dr. Mitchell helped secure the cabin, ensuring windows and doors were properly locked. As Ellena prepared to leave, she stood on her porch one last time, gazing out at the forest she had come to love. Rusty remained at his post near the tree line, watching the unusual activity with apparent interest. "I'll be back soon," Ellena called softly to the Bobcat. "Try to stay out of trouble until then." The drive to Dr. Mitchell's research cabin took them through some of Montana's most spectacular wilderness. Under different circumstances, Ellena might have enjoyed the journey and the younger woman's enthusiastic commentary on the local ecosystem. Instead, her thoughts remained with her home and the uncertain future that awaited her return. The research cabin proved to be more substantial than Ellena had imagined. A modern structure with solar panels, satellite internet, and comfortable furnishings that contrasted with its rustic exterior. "We use this as a base for various wildlife studies," Dr. Mitchell explained as she showed Eleanor around. "It's designed to have minimal environmental impact while providing researchers with necessary amenities." Eleanor was shown to a pleasant guest room with a window overlooking a meadow bordered by dense forest. After the night's ordeal, exhaustion suddenly overwhelmed her, and she gratefully accepted Dr. Mitchell's suggestion that she rest while the researcher set up some equipment. When Eleanor awoke several hours later, the afternoon sun was streaming through the window. She found Dr. Mitchell on the cabin's wraparound porch, focused intently on a laptop display. "Did you sleep well?" the younger woman asked, looking up with a warm smile. "Better than I expected," Eleanor admitted. "Any news from Sheriff Donovan?" Dr. Mitchell nodded. "He called while you were resting. They've located the truck the intruders were driving, abandoned near the state highway. They believe the men are headed toward Wyoming, but roadblocks have been established." The news was both reassuring and concerning. The immediate threat might be receding, but the men remained at large. Eleanor gazed out at the unfamiliar landscape, a sudden wave of homesickness washing over her. "I've been thinking about Rusty," she said softly. "I hope he's all right." Dr. Mitchell's expression shifted subtly, a hint of excitement breaking through her professional demeanor. "Actually, Ms. Thompson, there's something you should see." The researcher gestured toward a small monitor on the table beside her laptop. On the screen, a series of images from motion-activated cameras placed around the cabin property flashed in sequence. The most recent capture, time-stamped just 30 minutes earlier, showed a familiar form moving cautiously through the underbrush at the meadow's edge. "Is that—" Eleanor began, disbelief coloring her voice. Rusty, Dr. Mitchell confirmed, unable to contain her scientific excitement. He's followed us here, over 20 miles from his established territory, tracking you specifically to a location he's never been before. Do you understand how extraordinary this is? Eleanor felt a complex mixture of emotions: surprise, concern for Rusty's well-being, and a profound sense of connection that transcended rational explanation. "How is this possible?" she asked quietly. "How could he have found me?" Dr. Mitchell shook her head in wonder. "Bobcats have excellent tracking abilities, but this goes beyond normal behavior patterns. The bond between you must be incredibly strong." She hesitated, then added, "There's something else you should know. Sheriff Donovan called again just before you woke up. The investigation has uncovered some unusual information about the men who targeted your home." Ellena tensed. What kind of information? It seems they weren't ordinary burglars. According to files found in the abandoned truck, they've been working methodically through a list of properties in the region. But they weren't just looking for valuables. Dr. Mitchell turned her laptop screen toward Ellena. They were specifically targeting homes with potential access points to underground natural gas deposits. Your property sits atop what geological surveys suggest might be a significant reservoir. The revelation struck Ellena with unexpected force. Her peaceful retirement home, chosen for its isolation and natural beauty, might contain valuable resources beneath its surface. Resources that unscrupulous individuals were willing to obtain through intimidation and illegal means. "So they weren't just random thieves," Ellena murmured. "They wanted my land. Not just to steal from you," Dr. Mitchell clarified. "To force you out permanently. The documents suggest they've successfully intimidated several other elderly property owners in neighboring counties into selling at below-market rates after experiencing unexplained break-ins and vandalism." The scheme's calculated cruelty made Eleanor's earlier fear transform into righteous anger. These men hadn't just threatened her safety, they had attempted to strip away her autonomy, her right to determine her own future in the home she had chosen. As evening approached, Dr. Mitchell prepared dinner while continuing to monitor the wildlife cameras. Rusty had established a position in the meadow, maintaining a discreet distance from the cabin, but clearly visible to the research equipment. "He's waiting," Eleanor observed, watching the Bobcat's patient vigilance, "making sure I'm safe here before he decides what to do next." Dr. Mitchell nodded thoughtfully. "His behavior challenges our understanding of wildlife cognition and bonding. The research implications are fascinating, but..." She hesitated. "I'm more concerned about what happens when you return home. These men may be on the run now, but what's to stop others with similar motivations from targeting your property in the future?" The following morning brought clear skies and an unexpected visitor to the research cabin. Sheriff Donovan arrived just after breakfast, his expression a mixture of professional concern and personal relief at finding Ellena safe and comfortable in her temporary accommodation. "Good news," he announced as Dr. Mitchell served coffee on the porch. "State police apprehended Jake Collins and Scott Reeves attempting to cross into Wyoming. They're in custody, and based on evidence found in their vehicle, they'll be facing multiple charges." Ellena felt a weight lift from her shoulders. "And Derek Wade, still at large," the sheriff admitted, "but with his associates in custody and their operation exposed, he's likely moved on to easier targets." He sipped his coffee appreciatively. "The investigation has uncovered something interesting. Ms. Thompson, those men weren't working independently. They appear to be contractors for Meridian Resources, a shell company with connections to larger energy corporations." Dr. Mitchell leaned forward, her scientific curiosity piqued. "The natural gas deposits we discussed?" Sheriff Donovan nodded grimly. "Exactly. Preliminary investigation suggests Meridian has been using these intimidation tactics across 3 states, focusing on elderly or vulnerable property owners sitting on valuable resources." He turned to Ellena with a respectful gaze. You may have stumbled into something much bigger than a simple burglary attempt, Ms. Thompson. Ellena absorbed this information with the calm deliberation that had characterized her 35 years in the classroom. So they weren't just opportunistic thieves, they were following orders. Corporate-sponsored intimidation, Dr. Mitchell added, her tone reflecting her disgust. Using vulnerable citizens as pawns in their resource acquisition strategy. Sheriff, Donovan nodded. The FBI has taken an interest in the case. This could potentially lead to a multi-state investigation into predatory land acquisition practices. As they discussed the implications, Ellena noticed movement at the edge of the meadow visible from the porch. Rusty had emerged from his overnight shelter in the forest, moving with deliberate grace as he surveyed the morning landscape. When the Bobcat spotted the sheriff's vehicle, he froze momentarily, then settled into a watchful crouch some 50 yards from the cabin. Noticing the direction of Elena's gaze, Sheriff Donovan turned in his seat. "Well, I'll be damned," he murmured. "The cat really did follow you all the way here." Dr. Mitchell could barely contain her professional excitement. 20 miles outside his established territory, Sheriff. I've documented his movements since arrival, and he's maintained a consistent perimeter around the cabin, like he's on guard duty. The sheriff shook his head in wonder. In 20 years of law enforcement in Montana, I've never seen anything like it. Bobcats are solitary ambush predators, not protective guardians. And yet, Ellena said softly, watching as Rusty settled himself beneath a pine tree with a clear view of the cabin. Here he is. After finishing his coffee, Sheriff Donovan prepared to leave, promising to keep Eleanor updated on the investigation. Before departing, he hesitated, then asked a question that seemed to have been troubling him. "Ms. Thompson, did you know anything about the potential natural gas deposits on your property before now?" Ellena shook her head firmly. "Nothing whatsoever. I chose that location for its beauty and solitude, not what might lie beneath it." The sheriff nodded, seemingly satisfied. "That's what I thought. Unfortunately, this makes you even more vulnerable. Now that you're aware of the potential value, various interested parties might approach you with offers, some legitimate, others less so." "I have no intention of selling," Ellena stated firmly. "That land is my home." After the sheriff departed, Dr. Mitchell invited Ellena to join her in reviewing the wildlife camera footage from overnight. The researcher had positioned multiple cameras around the property, several specifically focused on monitoring Rusty's movements. "Look at this behavioral pattern," Dr. Mitchell pointed out, scrolling through time-stamped images. "He's established an actual patrol route around the perimeter of the property, with particular attention to the access road." Her finger traced the pattern on a map of the research station grounds. "This isn't random movement, it's purposeful surveillance." Ellena watched the systematic documentation of Rusty's protective behavior with mixed emotions. The scientific confirmation of their unusual bond was validating, yet she felt a twinge of concern about the attention it might bring. "What happens when your research on Rusty is published?" she asked. "Will others come looking for him? For us?" Dr. Mitchell's enthusiasm tempered visibly. "That's a valid concern. In published research, we could anonymize locations and your identity," but she paused, considering the implications. "The scientific community would certainly want verification, further studies, and yes, media attention would be likely. A prospect of unwanted attention from energy companies interested in her land and researchers interested in Rusty left Eleanor feeling suddenly overwhelmed. The peaceful retirement she had carefully constructed seemed to be slipping away through no fault of her own. Sensing her distress, Dr. Mitchell placed a reassuring hand on Eleanor's arm. "Nothing needs to be decided immediately. Your safety is the priority right now, followed by your right to privacy and autonomy. The research can wait." That afternoon, while Dr. Mitchell was occupied with a video conference, With her university colleagues, Ellena ventured outside onto the cabin's rear deck. From this vantage point, she could see Rusty resting in a patch of dappled sunlight at the forest's edge. "I've caused you quite a disruption, haven't I?" she said softly, though the bobcat was too distant to hear. "Both of us displaced from our homes because of human greed." Odile, to her surprise, Rusty's ears twitched, as if he had somehow perceived her voice across the distance. The bobcat rose, stretched in a fluid motion that reminded Eleanor of her long-ago house cat, and began a deliberate approach toward the cabin. Eleanor remained perfectly still as Rusty crossed the open meadow, something bobcats rarely did in daylight, and came closer than he had ever approached before. At the base of the deck steps, approximately 15 feet from where she stood, the wildcat settled onto his haunches, amber eyes fixed intently on her face. The moment felt charged with unspoken communication. Eleanor had never anthropomorphized Rusty, never pretended he was anything other than a wild animal with his own nature and instincts. Yet in this moment, the intelligence in his gaze seemed unmistakably directed, purposeful. "What are we going to do?" she asked quietly. "Both our homes are at risk now." From inside the cabin, she heard Dr. Mitchell's exclamation of surprise. Clearly, the researcher had spotted the unprecedented proximity through a window, but Eleanor remained focused on the extraordinary moment of connection, unwilling to break it by acknowledging the scientific observation taking place. After several minutes of this silent communion, Rusty rose and retreated unhurriedly to the forest edge, resuming his watchful guardianship from a more customary distance. When Eleanor returned inside, Dr. Mitchell was practically vibrating with scientific excitement. "Do you have any idea how extraordinary that interaction was?" she asked. He approached voluntarily in daylight, across open ground, to establish direct eye contact at close range. "That's unprecedented behavior for a non-habituated bobcat." Eleanor smiled gently at the younger woman's enthusiasm. "Sometimes extraordinary connections don't fit neatly into scientific categories, Dr. Mitchell." Later that evening, as they prepared dinner together, Dr. Mitchell received a phone call that changed her demeanor from excited to concerned. After a brief conversation punctuated with terse questions, she ended the call and turned to Eleanor with a troubled expression. "That was my department head," she explained. "Apparently someone from Meridian Resources contacted the university this afternoon, expressing interest in partnering on research regarding wildlife adaptation to resource extraction activities, with specific interest in our current bobcat studies." Eleanor immediately grasped the implication. "They're trying to locate me through your research." Dr. Mitchell nodded grimly. "It seems they've realized their strong-arm tactics failed and are now attempting a more sophisticated approach. My department head was suspicious of their sudden interest and wanted to warn me." She hesitated. "There's more. The caller specifically mentioned research being conducted in this region and asked about the Thompson case study." The revelation sent a chill through Eleanor. "How would they know about me in connection with your research? I've only been here one day." "That's what concerns me," Dr. Mitchell replied. "The only people who know about our arrangement are Sheriff Donovan, Deputy Garcia, and my department supervisor. Someone has been sharing information. The possibility of a leak within local law enforcement or the university was disturbing. Eleanor's temporary sanctuary suddenly felt less secure. "Should we relocate?" she asked, practical despite her concern. Dr. Mitchell considered the question carefully. "Not immediately. This location is secure and not officially connected to my bobcat research. Moving might actually draw more attention." She began preparing coffee with methodical focus. "But we should be strategic about our next steps." As night fell, Eleanor found herself standing at the bedroom window, gazing out at the darkened forest. Somewhere in those shadows, Rusty maintained his vigilant watch. The knowledge provided comfort, despite the rational understanding that a single bobcat could not protect her from the forces now arrayed against her peaceful existence. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Dr. Mitchell entered with 2 mugs of tea and a determined expression. "I've been thinking," the researcher said, offering one of the mugs to Ellena, "about your property rights and how to protect them." Ellena accepted the tea gratefully. "I'm listening." The presence of natural resources doesn't obligate you to allow their extraction. You own the surface rights to your property outright, correct? Ellena nodded. "Yes, purchased 15 years ago. The deed is in my safe deposit box in town." "That's important," Dr. Mitchell continued. "In Montana, surface owners often don't control mineral rights, which can be severed and sold separately. But even without mineral rights, you have legal protections regarding how extraction can occur on your property." The researcher explained how Ellena might be able to legally protect her land from unwanted development through conservation easements or similar legal instruments. It wouldn't prevent all claims, but it would create significant obstacles for companies seeking to extract resources without your cooperation. The conversation continued late into the evening, ranging from legal strategies to broader reflections on the relationship between humans and the natural world. Dr. Mitchell revealed that her interest in wildlife conservation stemmed from childhood, experiences in rural Idaho, where she had witnessed the gradual encroachment of development on wilderness areas. "What drew you to Whispering Pines?" the younger woman asked, as their conversation reached a natural lull. "Out of all the places you could have retired, why that particular spot?" Eleanor's expression softened with remembrance. "My late husband, Robert, and I vacationed in Montana every summer during our teaching careers. We always dreamed of retiring here." A wistful smile played at her lips. "After he passed, I couldn't face the suburban neighborhood where we'd spent our married life. Too many memories, too much absence." She described how she had driven through western Montana for weeks, searching for a place that felt right. "When I found that cabin with its view of the mountains and forests, something just clicked. It wasn't just beautiful, it felt like somewhere I could heal, somewhere I could build a new chapter of my life." Dr. Mitchell's expression reflected her understanding. "And now Meridian Resources threatens all of that." "Yes," Eleanor agreed, her jaw setting with quiet determination. "But I've faced difficult situations before. When you've taught elementary school for 35 years, you develop a certain resilience." 3 days had passed since Eleanor's relocation to the research cabin. The morning dawned with a crisp clarity that hinted at the approaching autumn, golden light filtering through the pines surrounding the property. Ellena sat on the porch, with her morning coffee, watching as Rusty emerged from his nighttime shelter to bask in the early sunlight at the forest's edge. The ringing of Dr. Mitchell's phone broke the peaceful moment. The researcher answered, her expression shifting from professional neutrality to concerned attention as she listened to the caller. After a brief conversation, she turned to Ellena. "That was Sheriff Donovan. They've received information that Derek Wade has been spotted back in Whispering Pines. The sheriff believes he might be casing your property again." Eleanor's hand tightened around her coffee mug. "Even with his associates in custody?" "It seems he's determined, Doctor," Mitchell replied. "Or desperate. The sheriff mentioned that the FBI investigation into Meridian Resources is gaining momentum. Corporate records have been subpoenaed, and several executives are facing questioning." The news should have been reassuring. Justice was proceeding, the conspiracy being unraveled, yet Ellena felt a profound unease. Her home remained vulnerable, and the man who had first targeted it was still at large. The sheriff also mentioned something else, Dr. Mitchell continued, hesitation evident in her voice. "Your neighbor, Roy Jenkins, reported smoke coming from your cabin's chimney yesterday." Ellena straightened in alarm. "Someone's staying in my home." "It appears so. The sheriff is organizing a team to investigate, but he wanted us to know the situation." The thought of an intruder occupying her carefully tended home filled Ellena with indignation that overshadowed her fear. 15 years of memories, of rebuilding her life after loss, all potentially being violated by someone who viewed her property merely as an obstacle to profit. "I should go back," she said firmly. Dr. Mitchell looked startled. "Ms. Thompson, with Derek Wade still at large and potentially at your property, that would be extremely dangerous." "It's my home," Ellena stated simply, "and I won't be driven from it by fear or intimidation." Their debate was interrupted by the arrival of an unfamiliar vehicle, a black SUV with government plates that pulled up beside Dr. Mitchell's car. A woman in her 40s emerged, dressed in the unmistakable professional attire of a federal agent. "Dr. Sarah Mitchell, Ms. Ellena Thompson," she called, approaching the porch with confident strides. "I'm Special Agent Melissa Carter, FBI. I was hoping for a few minutes of your time." The agent was invited inside, where she declined coffee but accepted a glass of water. Her demeanor was professional yet compassionate as she explained the purpose of her visit. "The investigation into Meridian Resources has expanded significantly," she explained. "What began as a local case of intimidation and attempted forced property acquisition has revealed a pattern spanning 3 states and potentially dozens of victims." Eleanor listened as Agent Carter outlined how Meridian had systematically targeted elderly or isolated property owners, using escalating intimidation tactics to pressure them into selling their land at below-market prices. The company's connections to larger energy corporations were being scrutinized, with evidence suggesting that executives had deliberately chosen vulnerable targets unlikely to have the resources to fight back. "Your case is particularly significant, Ms. Thompson," the agent continued, "because you're the first victim who successfully resisted their initial tactics and brought the matter to law enforcement." She paused, her expression sympathetic but direct, "which unfortunately makes you a loose end they may feel compelled to address." The implications hung heavily in the cabin's warm interior. Dr. Mitchell spoke first, voicing the question that had immediately formed in Eleanor's mind. "Are you suggesting Ms. Thompson is in danger beyond simple property intimidation?" Agent Carter chose her words carefully. "We're concerned that the stakes have escalated. Meridian Resources is facing potential criminal charges, substantial fines, and civil litigation. The individuals involved have powerful motivations to minimize their exposure by eliminating evidence and witnesses." Eleanor absorbed this sobering assessment with outward calm, though her heart raced at the implications. "What about Derek Wade? Sheriff Donovan mentioned he's been seen near my property again." "Wade is a contractor, not a Meridian employee," Carter explained. "Our intelligence suggests he's been cut loose by the company as they attempt to distance themselves from the more aggressive tactics. He may be acting independently now, possibly hoping to salvage something from the operation or simply out of vindictiveness." The conversation turned to protective measures. Agent Carter recommended that Eleanor consider temporary relocation to a more secure environment, perhaps with family in another state, until the investigation concluded and arrests were made. "I don't have family," Eleanor stated simply, "and I won't be driven from my home indefinitely. It's all I have." The agent's expression reflected understanding beneath her professional demeanor. "Then we need to discuss alternatives. The Bureau can provide temporary protective surveillance, but our resources are limited in rural areas like Whispering Pines." As they discussed security options, Dr. Mitchell, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly straightened in her chair. "There's an angle we haven't considered," she said, her scientific mind clearly processing possibilities. "The Bobcat." Agent Carter looked confused. "I'm sorry?" Dr. Mitchell quickly explained the extraordinary situation with Rusty, his protective behavior toward Ellena, his tracking her to the research cabin, and his continued vigilance. "With all due respect, Dr. Mitchell," Agent Carter replied after listening attentively. "While that's scientifically fascinating, I don't see how a wild animal factors into a protection strategy against determined human threats." "Because it changes the narrative, Doctor," Mitchell insisted, growing animated as her idea took shape. "Right now, Ms. Thompson is vulnerable because she's isolated and viewed as an easy target. But what if we change that perception?" Ellena began to understand the direction of the younger woman's thoughts. "You want to publicize my connection with Rusty?" "Exactly," Dr. Mitchell confirmed. "A human interest story about an elderly woman protected by a wild bobcat would draw media attention. Public scrutiny is the last thing Meridian Resources wants right now, and it would make any further intimidation tactics considerably more risky for them." Agent Carter considered the proposal with professional assessment. "There's merit to creating a public profile as a protective measure," she acknowledged, "though I'd be concerned about sensationalizing the situation or creating additional security risks through publicity." The discussion continued, weighing various approaches and their potential consequences. By early afternoon, a tentative plan had been formulated. Ellena would return to her home under FBI protection, while Dr. Mitchell would document Rusty's behavior for potential limited release to media outlets if the situation warranted it. "I can't guarantee your safety," Agent Carter warned as they finalized arrangements. "But between local law enforcement, our surveillance, and the deterrent effect of potential publicity, we can significantly reduce the risk." As the agent prepared to leave, a call came through on her secure phone. After a brief, terse conversation, she turned to Ellena and Dr. Mitchell with a grave expression. "That was Sheriff Donovan. His deputies just arrived at your cabin, Ms. Thompson. Derek Wade was indeed there, and he resisted arrest." Her expression softened slightly. "He's in custody now, but there's something else you should know. He didn't break in, he had a key." The revelation struck Eleanor like a physical blow. "That's impossible. Only I have keys to my cabin." "And perhaps someone you trusted," Agent Carter suggested gently. "Sheriff Donovan believes there may be a connection between Wade and someone in the local community, someone who provided information about your movements and property." The thought that someone Ellena knew might be involved in the conspiracy against her was profoundly disturbing. Her mind raced through possibilities: acquaintances in town, service providers who had access to her home, neighbors. "Is Roy safe?" she asked suddenly, thinking of her nearest neighbor who had reported the smoke. "Mr. Jenkins is fine," Agent Carter assured her. "In fact, he was instrumental in Wade's capture. He noticed unusual activity and contacted the sheriff immediately." The remainder of the day passed in a blur of preparations. Agent Carter coordinated with local FBI resources, while Dr. Mitchell gathered her research equipment and prepared the cabin for departure. Ellena packed her few belongings, her thoughts alternating between apprehension and determination to reclaim her home. As sunset approached, final arrangements were confirmed. They would depart early the following morning with an FBI escort to ensure safe passage back to Whispering Pines. Dr. Mitchell would follow in her own vehicle with her research equipment. That evening, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, Eleanor stepped onto the cabin's porch to clear her mind. The night was cool and still, stars blazing in the clear mountain sky. At the forest's edge, a familiar silhouette materialized, Rusty, maintaining his vigilant watch, even as preparations were made to return to their shared territory. "We're going home tomorrow," Ellena said softly into the darkness. "Back to our own place." The bobcat's ears twitched at the sound of her voice, his amber eyes reflecting the cabin's light as he watched her from his position. Ellena felt an overwhelming surge of gratitude for this wild creature's inexplicable loyalty. Morning arrived with a spectacular sunrise that painted the mountains in gold and crimson. As the small convoy prepared to depart, Dr. Mitchell approached Ellena with a concerned expression. "I've been thinking about the key," she said quietly. "For Wade to have one, someone with access to your home must have made a copy." Ellena nodded grimly. "I've been considering who might have had the opportunity. It's a short list, but the betrayal would be significant, regardless of who it turns out to be." The drive back to Whispering Pines took them through winding mountain roads, just beginning to show the first hints of autumn color. Agent Carter led in her government SUV, while Eleanor rode with Dr. Mitchell, their conversation flowing naturally between reflections on recent events and lighter topics that provided welcome distraction. "I'm curious," Dr. Mitchell said as they approached the turnoff to the familiar dirt road leading to Eleanor's cabin. "What will you do about the natural gas deposits if this all gets resolved? The land will still be valuable to energy companies." Ellena had given this considerable thought during her sleepless night. "I'm considering a conservation easement," she replied. "Something that would protect the land from development even after I'm gone." Dr. Mitchell smiled approvingly. "That would certainly honor your connection with the land and with Rusty." As they rounded the final bend in the road, Eleanor's cabin came into view, looking remarkably unchanged, despite the drama that had centered around it. Agent Carter's vehicle pulled to a stop in the driveway, and the agent emerged, scanning the surroundings with professional vigilance. "All clear," she called, gesturing for them to approach. Eleanor stepped from the car, breathing deeply of the familiar pine-scented air. Despite everything that had happened, a profound sense of rightness settled over her as she stood once again on her own property. This was home, regardless of who had coveted it or threatened her peace. Inside, the cabin showed signs of Wade's unwelcome occupation: unwashed dishes in the sink, muddy boot prints on the floor, scattered belongings, but remained essentially intact. No vandalism, no deliberate damage. Sheriff Donovan had ensured the space was thoroughly checked and secured before their arrival. "I'll need to clean," Eleanor observed with practical assessment, "but it's not as bad as I feared." As Dr. Mitchell helped her restore order to the cabin, Agent Carter coordinated with other law enforcement personnel, establishing a discreet security perimeter around the property. By mid-afternoon, a semblance of normalcy had been restored, though the presence of federal agents in the surrounding forest represented a significant departure from Eleanor's usual peaceful isolation. "We'll maintain surveillance for at least 72 hours, Agent Carter explained over coffee at Eleanor's kitchen table. "By then, we should have a clearer picture of Meridian's remaining operations in the area and any potential ongoing threats." Dr. Mitchell, who had been setting up wildlife cameras around the property, joined them with excited news. "Rusty's back already," she reported. "He's established a position at the north edge of the clearing. It's remarkable how quickly he returned to his territorial behavior here." Agent Carter's skepticism about the Bobcat's significance had softened somewhat after witnessing Dr. Mitchell's documented evidence of his unusual behavior. "Your research could actually be significant to our case," she admitted. "It establishes a pattern of territorial defense that Wade and his associates would have encountered during their surveillance and attempted break-ins." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Donovan's patrol vehicle. The sheriff entered with a manila envelope and a grave expression. "Ms. Thompson," he said without preamble, "we've identified who provided Derek Wade with a key to your cabin." Ellena braced herself, dreading to hear the name of someone she had trusted. "Who was it?" The sheriff placed the envelope on the table. "Benjamin Wilson." "Ben?" Eleanor's surprise was genuine. "The general store owner. But why would he be involved with Meridian Resources?" Sheriff Donovan opened the envelope, revealing photographs of financial records. "His store has been struggling for years. Turns out he received substantial cash deposits corresponding with Meridian's activities in the area. When confronted, he admitted to being paid for information about local property owners, including making a copy of your house key when you left it with him to give to your handyman last spring. The betrayal stung, particularly from someone Ellena had considered a friend for 15 years. Ben had been a fixture in the community, trusted implicitly by generations of Whispering Pines residents. "There's more," the sheriff continued, his expression softening with sympathy. Wilson kept detailed records of his interactions with Meridian's representatives, names, dates, payment amounts. He's cooperating fully with the investigation in exchange for leniency. Agent Carter leaned forward, her professional interest piqued. That could be extremely valuable evidence for the larger case against Meridian's corporate leadership. The news represented a significant breakthrough in the investigation, yet Ellena found herself contemplating the human element, how financial desperation had led a respected community member to betray his neighbor's trust. Later that evening, after the law enforcement personnel had established their positions around the property and Dr. Mitchell had retired to the guest room to review her research data, Ellena sat alone on her porch in the gathering darkness. The familiar sounds of her forest surrounded her, the whisper of wind through pine needles, the occasional hoot of an owl, the distant rushing of the creek behind her property. Movement at the forest's edge drew her attention. Rusty emerged into the dim light cast by the porch lamp, his movements deliberate as he approached closer than he ever had before. At the bottom of the porch steps, approximately 10 feet from where Ellena sat, the Bobcat paused, amber eyes fixed intently. On her face, "We made it home," she said softly. "Both of us." The Bobcat settled onto his haunches, maintaining his steady gaze. In that moment of connection, Eleanor felt a profound sense of mutual understanding that transcended conventional boundaries between human and wild animal. They had each defended their shared territory in their own way, Eleanor through her refusal to be intimidated, Rusty through his inexplicable but unmistakable protective instincts. The sound of the cabin door opening broke the moment. Dr. Mitchell emerged onto the porch, freezing when she saw the unprecedented proximity of the Bobcat. "Don't move," she whispered, her scientific amazement evident despite her hushed tone. "This is extraordinary." Rusty's ears twitched at the new voice, but he remained in place, his gaze returning to Ellena as if completing an interrupted conversation. After several more moments of this silent communion, he rose gracefully and retreated to a more customary distance, settling beneath a pine tree with a clear view of the cabin and its surroundings. "I've never seen anything like it," Dr. Mitchell breathed, sinking into the chair beside Ellena. "He's not just habituated to human presence, he's formed a specific bond with you that defies conventional wildlife behavior patterns." Ellena smiled gently. "Sometimes the most meaningful connections can't be fully explained by science, Dr. Mitchell." The younger woman nodded thoughtfully. "Perhaps that's the real lesson in all of this, that there are forms of loyalty and connection that transcend our usual categories and expectations." As darkness settled fully over the forest, Ellena felt a deep sense of peace returning. The threat hadn't fully passed. Meridian Resources' corporate case would take months to resolve, and the company might yet attempt other tactics to access the natural gas beneath her property. But something fundamental had shifted in her relationship with her home and the wilderness surrounding it. She was no longer merely a retired teacher who had sought solitude in the Montana forests. She had become something more, a defender of this land, connected to it and its wild guardian in ways that corporations seeking profit could never truly understand. The stars emerged one by one in the clear mountain sky, a tapestry of light above the dark silhouettes of the pines. Ellena and Dr. Mitchell sat in companionable silence, watching as Rusty maintained his vigilant presence at the forest's edge. "What will you include in your research paper?" Ellena asked eventually. Dr. Mitchell considered the question carefully. The scientific observations, certainly. Rusty's territorial behavior, the tracking capabilities he demonstrated, the unusual human-wildlife bonding. But perhaps not your specific location or the full details of the Meridian situation. She smiled. Some things deserve protection from excessive scrutiny. Like an old woman and her unlikely friendship with a bobcat, Ellena suggested. Like a remarkable partnership between two beings who recognized something valuable in each other, Dr. Mitchell corrected gently. 3 months later, a small ceremony took place on Ellena's property. Representatives from the Montana Land Trust, local officials, Sheriff Donovan, and Dr. Mitchell gathered to witness Ellena's signing of conservation. Documents that would permanently protect her land from development, even after her lifetime. The investigation into Meridian resources had resulted in multiple indictments, with corporate executives facing charges ranging from conspiracy to environmental violations. Ben Wilson had received a suspended sentence in exchange for his testimony. Though his reputation in Whispering Pines would never fully recover, Dr. Mitchell's research paper on interspecies bonding had been accepted by a prestigious scientific journal, carefully anonymized to protect Eleanor's privacy while documenting the extraordinary behavior of a Montana bobcat that had formed an unprecedented protective relationship with a human. As the small gathering dispersed, Ellena remained on her porch, watching the winter sunlight glint off fresh snow that blanketed her property. From his position near the woodpile, Rusty watched the departing vehicles with alert attention, his coat thicker now for the winter months. When the last car disappeared down the winding road, Ellena smiled at her improbable guardian. "Just us again," she said softly, "as it should be." The bobcat blinked slowly in response, a gesture that seemed almost like acknowledgement. Together, they had faced threats from those who viewed their shared territory as nothing more than a resource to be exploited. Together, they had protected what mattered, not just the land itself, but the connection they had formed across the supposed boundaries between human and wild. As twilight approached, Ellena went inside to prepare her evening tea. Through the kitchen window, she watched as Rusty began his nightly patrol of the property perimeter, his movements purposeful and vigilant in the gathering darkness. Some called it a mysterious bond, others a scientific anomaly. But for Ellena Thompson, it was simply a reminder that the most powerful connections in life often come from unexpected sources, if only we have the wisdom to recognize and honor them. Dear listeners, we hope you've been captivated by Ellena and Rusty's extraordinary bond. Their story reminds us that connection and loyalty can transcend the boundaries we often place between humans and the natural world. For more emotionally resonant tales like this one, we've prepared a special playlist of similarly moving stories. You'll find it by clicking on the link to your left. If Ellena's courage and Rusty's devotion touched your heart, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day, we bring you unique narratives that explore life's complexity and unexpected relationships. What was your favorite moment in Ellena and Rusty's journey? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments section below.